Okay, so good evening all and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. We have a relatively light agenda tonight, but I hope that doesn't mean the discussions will be light also. There's plenty to get stuck into. In terms of apologies, I've got apologies from Councillor Jane Burton and Councillor Whitcroft, who are both poorly this evening. It's that time of year, I suppose, isn't it? And I believe Councillor Waller is substituting for Councillor Fenton. Welcome to the Funhouse, Councillor Waller. Any declarations of interest before we get into main business, Councillor Waller?
Thank you. Although it is on my register of interest, I think as we're discussing parking near schools, I live next to a school, Westfield School.
Thank you, Councillor Waller. I suppose I should say I also live next to a school. Does anybody else live next to a school? Okay, thank you. Minutes from the previous meeting. Any members have comments to make on those? Councillor Healy.
Super quickie on resolved point 1, page 5. It was all around the state of roads as compared to the regional and national average. Have we had anything back from officers yet?
I don't think we have. No, okay. No, I've not received anything, but we can chase that up.
If you could, that would be.
Yeah. Thank you. Any more from colleagues? I had one minor amendment to make, if I may. We just find that's what I mean. I've lost half the comments I made earlier on. Oh yes, so it was on page 6, the second resolved, where it says to recommend that the executive explore all possible options to ensure blue badge access to the city centre during the period of the Christmas market, including the layout of future Christmas markets. I think it might just be tidier to put including reviewing the layout of future Christmas markets, because that was sort of a related but separate discussion around whether it was just a pleasant market anyway, irrespective of the blue badge issue, for residents to enjoy and crowd management and all of that. So it'd simply be inserting the word reviewing before layout. Any issues with that, colleagues? No? Thank you. Okay, so outside of those amendments or those points, we'll see those minutes as approved. We have no public speakers tonight, sadly. It is always a shame. So we'll just jump into the first main item of business, which is regarding travel to school. And this is on the work plan following, I think it's an issue that comes up in all of our wards. I know in Holgate Ward, we've been lobbied by residents over the years to make travel to school more pleasant and feel safer or safer outright. But it's a big topic and we have many schools to work across. If the relevant officers, and we have the executive member, Councillor Aurelius, here too, if you can introduce yourselves and give an opening spiel, that'd be great. We will take the papers as read, but if you can give a brief opening, that would be grand, and then we'll get into questions and comments. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks very much, Councillor Taylor. My name's Julian Ridge. I'm the Transport Strategy Lead for City of York Council. So first of all, I'm glad you mentioned about taking the papers as read, because my first thing was to say I hope you've read your briefing papers, because there's a fairly lengthy one about that, including the DFT Active Travel England guidance, which came out between the publication deadline of the paper and this meeting, but which I think is very useful because it helps us set out the position very well. So in many ways, I suppose this is a classic bit of local authority transport planning. We have a lot of policy support from the new local transport strategy for measures which increase the number of children walking and cycling and catching the bus to school. And it also fits very well with the council's wider policies as set out in the council plan. Our big transport conversation, which we did this time last year, also showed that there was a lot of public support for increasing non-car travel to school. Secondly, we pretty much know what we can do to influence the amount of travel to school which takes place by non-car modes. We have some experience in York, which my colleague Tom will talk about in a minute. And there are many places in the UK which do it very well, where we can look at what they do and we can copy it to our own advantage. We have the new guidance from Active Travel England about school streets, and in York, in the last couple of weeks, we've also gained the power to enforce moving traffic offences, which will help us no end if we choose to go down the road of forming school streets. But on the other hand, it's a very, very large area of activity. Pretty much every bit of highway and footway in the city is part of someone's journey to school and makes up the network that is used for people's journeys to school. Secondly, it's suffered very badly over the years from poor funding availability, particularly for the revenue activities such as data collection and working with schools, which are so essential to delivering this. And this has really limited what we've been able to do in the last few years. And I think unless there's a change in that, it will limit what we can do in the future. Now, Tom's going to say a little bit about what we do at the moment, particularly the activity of our ITRIL team.
Evening, everyone. I'm Tom Horner. I'm the Head of Active and Sustainable Transport at the Council. So I won't go into too much depth because a lot of it's in the report, but essentially we've got quite a light programme of school engagement at the moment. There's 4 broad areas where the iTravel team still have some involvement in doing some good work. But the Active Travel Ambassadors in partnership with Mode Shift. So that's a secondary school based programme, and we're currently working with Applefields and St Peters there. It's a national scheme, and that's a very much a young person led programme to identify ways in which school travel could be improved, and then the school gets funding to help implement some of those ideas. There's the Living Streets WOW programme, which used to sort of stand for Walk Once a Week. That's now a general national scheme, and then primary school children can record their travel to work and get badges as a reward for doing that. We've got Mode Shift Stars, and that is for the school, and that rewards the school with credit for when they are delivering their travel plan activities. And then we also support Walk to School Week once a year in October. So there's a couple of other capital programmes around school infrastructure and safe routes to school that we currently do as well, but that's broadly where we are within current resource at the moment.
Okay, so back to me. So you can see that there's activity we do at the moment, and there are a number of ways that we could enhance that activity if we chose to do so. And looking at it, the paper sets out what the ingredients would be of a potential programme to increase our travel to school activity, but it's very dependent on what funding could be made available for the delivery of that. The basic ingredients of that programme would be something like data collection to baseline what is currently happening in individual schools and what facilities are available to help pupils travel sustainably. So is there secure storage for bikes, for example? We would use that data to set targets and prioritise action, but that would cost around £100,000 in revenue spend. We could undertake promotional campaigns. So the obvious thing to do here would be to look particularly towards the 10 secondary schools and 2 colleges, because by doing that, we can look to influence the travel behaviour of a large number of pupils. So there are as many pupils in the secondary schools and the colleges as there are in the primary schools, but there are 12 secondary schools and colleges and 53 primary schools. That programme could provide information about safe routes to school, bus routes that travel to school and other sustainable transport that's available. and we could provide that for distribution to the pupils, that would cost perhaps another £20,000 or so in revenue spend. School travel plans, we could progress those. We've done that work in the past. In the past, we used 2 members of staff to undertake that piece of work, and the cost of that was approximately £70,000 of revenue spent. We also now have the potential to enforce school streets. We've gained powers to do that, but if I'm absolutely honest, I need to manage expectations that this is a panacea, and the guidance from Active Travel England makes this, it is incredibly useful in highlighting this, because whilst it is an enabling document and it says what local authorities would have to do to deliver school streets programmes, it also lays out the limitations of some of the means of doing it, particularly things like barriers and use of volunteers. So the new guidance makes it clear that volunteer-led schemes can be used in some places, but they're not really suitable for most school streets. So in the absence of volunteer and barrier type schemes, inevitably you're looking at schemes which are enforced using automatic number plate recognition cameras. Now, again, that's something that can be done. We use those cameras in other locations in York, but there are installation costs associated with them. You would need back offices, you would need to undertake the full TRO consultation process for one. And once the equipment is installed, there is a 6-month period when you cannot enforce against first offences. So if somebody drives through the ANPR camera, the first time they do it, you send them a letter to say that you can find them on subsequent occasions. But obviously there are costs associated with sending out the letters and so on and so forth, which you can't recoup. Obviously, any highway scheme has potential additional capital costs, for example, for signs, bollards, planters, speed reduction measures, etc., and they would be scheme specific. Finally, obviously, there's a lot of potential for capital measures, particularly around design of segregated cycle routes and segregated cycle facilities, but also improvements to pavements. You know, again, we know what would be needed, and in some places we've done work with the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan to identify particular areas where we could put measures in place which would help most school pupils, particularly around places where there are clusters of schools, of which that is the case in a few places in York. But again, we would need to find funds to make those changes, and capital projects obviously are scalable to what funding you have available, but in some cases, really extensive capital programs can be quite expensive. So certainly from my perspective, that is a kind of summary of the position where we are. I'm very happy to discuss that or answer questions or anything which has occurred to members as they've read through the briefing papers.
Thank you for that opening. It's very much appreciated. Colleagues around the table, anyone want to get started? Councillor Merritt.
Yes. Couple of questions in terms of where we go from here. You've mentioned, I think, 4 different potential schemes that we could look at. What evidence is there of the relative effectiveness of those different schemes in terms of influencing behaviour and getting the shift? That's my first question. And the second question is, what are the exemplar authorities doing? Are they using some of these particular schemes, or are they doing something different?
So I will have to confess at this point that this is not my specialist area of expertise. So I think looking across the UK is something that we could do, and we could report back to this meeting if need be. I will, I think, probably end up giving what you consider to be some quite generic responses, but if you bear with us. So I think, I mean, in many ways, travel to school is like any travel. It's just, you know, it's not in its nature, it's not dissimilar from commuting, or travel to retail or whatever. So whilst there are, I mean, I've got 5 areas of intervention. So there's data collection, promotion, school travel plans, school streets, and capital measures. I think inevitably you have to take forward all of those. It's probably not really a question of picking and choosing, because if you, for example, were just to do promotion or school travel plans, you run the risk of encouraging travel along highways that some pupils will consider to be unsafe. So there is a question that in ideal circumstances, and if you look at places, and I'm thinking, if I'm being honest, outside the UK, where there is a lot more active travel to school, so particularly Germany and the Netherlands, Belgium, they have both used capital measures to provide all the infrastructure and undertaken the promotion. So it's quite systemic.
I can just add a little bit to that. I think one of the exemplar authorities in the country, Council of Merit's Waltham Forest down in London, they've had the sort of powers a bit longer. So there's school streets have been implemented down there quite extensively as part of neighbourhood projects, and then they've had some bigger cycling and walking infrastructure programmes across some of the radial routes. But there's some really encouraging results from a mode shift perspective in that area, and I think some of the other London authorities are doing similar. So that's probably the way we'd be looking in terms of learning from other areas. When you start to get into the promotion, the data collection, like Julian says, absolute core foundation of being able to do this properly, because as we've sort of alluded to in the report, and you all know really, but everyone's journey to school, there's a bespoke set of circumstances behind that. It might be linked to going to work off the back of it. It might be, there might be other circumstances, I want to visit family, whatever. All those different things mean you have to get the data right and understand why people are travelling like they are. So that's a key foundation, I suspect, to being able to get the maximum result when you do implement something. But the school streets have been successful in Waltham Forest. They typically sort of enforce using ANPR cameras, but they'll only have a couple of cameras and they'll move them around different zones rather than having a physical mounted camera each specific zone on each specific school street. And then the capital interventions are often required as safety measures. It's logic really. If you put a safe crossing point on a desire line for children and families travelling to school, you're going to make that more attractive route for walking. So we can do a bit more work on the data and look at some of those other authorities and look to Waltham Forest. I think we can provide a supplementary note if it'd be helpful.
I think a really important, sorry.
No, go on.
I think a really important thing that can't be stressed enough is obviously that when you talk about travel to school, you're talking about, the people who are beginning to travel to school are 4, and by the time they finish travelling to school, they're 18. And over that time, the way that people travel to way that pupils travel to school changes enormously. So at the bottom of that, for the youngest children, you are talking about people whose travel to school will be entirely accompanied by parents or carers. And and I know from my children's school that the teachers would actually refuse to release pupils up to the age of about 10 unless there was a parent or carer there to collect them. Now, I don't know whether that is the case in all schools. Obviously, by the time you get to pupils who are at sixth form or in further education, you've got pupils who've got very complicated travel habits. They might be combining their education with part-time jobs or doing placements or musical activities or whatever. So they're moving around. You've got children who by that age are able to drive. So the information that you produce needs to be different, and it needs to take that into account. And obviously there is there is a tremendous risk of generalizing, but at primary school level, you have pupils tend to have shorter trips to school, and they tend to be accompanied. So you're information that you produce in your school travel planning has to take that into account. At secondary school and college level, pupils tend to be travelling independently, and many of them will be travelling longer distances. So they're perhaps more likely to be using the bus and cycles than walking, for example. And again, you have to take all this into account in what you're doing.
Thank you for that. I've got Councillor Waller next and Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Chair. I did read with great interest the volunteer fatigue in reference to the School Street barrier system. I think that may be, on the whole, probably a step more than the individual schools may want. And I think what I'd ask is, do you have information from each school as to the local interventions that they would appreciate, because of each school's in a very different situation? In terms of the camera enforcement, will the camera ban come back? Because that was overnight the greatest increase in adherence to the existing double yellow lines and enforcement, because people did feel that there was a very real chance of them being caught, compared to the parking wardens who can only come out to schools at a set frequency because there are only so many of them relative to the number of schools, and that was the only other way of having particular enforcement. It's also recognizing the changes in behaviours. Having lived in the same house for 21 years, what situations occurred 21 years ago were nothing like the aggression and the situation that members of staff trying to ensure that the vast majority of kids who are walking into school have that safe crossing to get home. So I think there's as much as effort's gone into the persuasion with the sack the chauffeur booklet handed out to schools and talks, and the cardboard cutouts to remind drivers of the relative heights of young children. And also say that the travel to school, there's a lot of under fours being transported, and that in itself creates an increased number of cars, whereas, as I say, most pupils are actually walking. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that, Councillor Waller. I mean, there are a number of aspects to that question. So the first one was about, do we have a list of what schools want? We know, I mean, we engage with schools. We know what some of the schools want. We don't know what all of the schools want. But if we were to do a comprehensive data collection process, we would get that granular data. That would be a very important output of that piece of work. But you know, different schools have different priorities, and schools in rural areas, for example, have probably got much wider catchments than ones in you know, the densely populated bits of inner York. So there are some there's differences between the different schools. Now, what was your second question? Camera van. We have no plans at the moment to bring the camera van back. It's something that we could look at, and it needs to be thought of within the moving traffic offences. I would have to check exactly what the legislation is at the moment, because I think the reason we lost the camera van is that local authorities were no longer permitted to enforce using it for anything apart from bus lanes. And I think we've possibly got those powers back again in the last couple of weeks. So, but I will check.
Yeah, thank you for that. Councillor Hook, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I noticed with joy that you mentioned the pupils that live beyond the ring road, and a third of them, which is quite a big number, really, considering the others are quite densely packed in the middle. Obviously, got different needs to the ones that live near, well, in the more populated areas. And the fact that only no senior schools are actually outside of that boundary either. So this morning I took it on myself to post 2 questions on Facebook, one to the people of Skelton, one to the people of Poppleton, and I've actually got some really good replies from them. Some of which, because we're now, if you don't go to Manor School and you live in Poppleton, then you've got to catch buses. And it's just simple things like the bus timetable that no longer fits in with school opening times. You either get there far too early or get there late, neither of which you really want to do. You've also got some other bad behaviours of drivers that applies not just to school children, but to 85-year-olds when it's icy as well, apparently. So hopefully it'll be all right for me to give you what they say. And obviously Skelton's got the other big problem that to get to their secondary school, if it's Manor, they've got to go over the railway bridge on the ring road that is hell to ride on, even in sunny, nice, dry weather. But once you get winds, you get ice and things, you've got to be foolhardy and mad to do it. And I saw a child cycling over it today with no lights or anything. And I thought he's foolhardy, but he doesn't realise, but his parents are probably concerned. So if I can give you this, that would be great. The other question is, it's the fact that schools are being uncooperative. And that's really worrying. I mean, how do we try and persuade schools not to be so uncooperative?
I think there's a sort of the optimum place where we'd love to be would be for the schools to have enough resource to engage, us to have enough resource to engage back and work the problems through, and then have some capital funding or some other funding to be able to implement something, so that you've got something really tangible to work to when you're developing a travel plan. That's kind of like your absolute benchmark. And our understanding simply is that the schools are that busy now that they have to have someone with a really keen interest in sustainable transport, generally speaking, or someone who really gets this agenda to want to engage. And that's a lot of the challenge. And to be fair, that there's a challenge on our side because we don't have those travel planning coordinators anymore to be able to sit down and talk through the bespoke circumstances that you've just articulated around people from Skelton and Poppleton getting to Manor. So that's been blunt. That's where we are. And to get that data right that we spoke about at the start, you need to be able to have that ability to engage both from the school's perspective and from our perspective, and then try and translate that into something that will actually improve people's journey to school to make a difference. So there's a few things that we're looking at different funding opportunities. There's bits of capability funding from Active Travel England. There's other potential opportunities associated with the local cycling and walking infrastructure plan that we're going to bring into executive that came through this committee, that hopefully we'll be able to say, actually, yeah, that will bring in some infrastructure funding for walking zones and for cycle routes. So there's a few things that we can move on, but that you've hit on it there. It's the big gap really, is that resource and ability to sort of get out there, speak and develop projects that are really going to make a difference on the ground. And we'd be delighted to take the comments if you're able to share them. And I can't promise we'll be able to do a huge amount with them in the short term, but we'll absolutely have a look and see if there's anything we can do.
Thank you. Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. I confess my first response here was to look around the table and see if there was a dormouse sleeping in a teacup. We've been watching for decades.
Sorry, Councillor Vassie,
to move forward.
That bit's lost on me. What? Can you elaborate? Forgive me.
The party that goes on and on and on and never ends.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Everyone sits around the table. In 2003, I was first elected. I attended scrutiny meetings organised by a councillor emeritus in charge of looking at cycling. And the years have passed and local transport plans have come and gone. And we've heard the word modal shift in various fonts and different sizes and accents, and carbon emissions keep going up. And I know we're all good people around this table, and I know we all want to see change, but somehow we're all overseeing a long history of failure. We're not bad people, but that's the reality. And I know the executive member cares just as passionately about this as I do, and I know all of us do. So for me, the question is, where are the practical things that are going to deliver change? Endlessly rehearsing new policies and new data collections and who we can persuade to volunteer to do this or do that hasn't delivered change, and it won't deliver change. And the emissions from transport that we're trying to bring down go up year in, year out. They're already well over 70%. So my questions relate very much to one practical scheme, not because it's the only scheme, but because it's one I know. And I suppose I've just written here in brackets, I've just been to Japan. And when I hear that, you know, children are not able to go independently to school, in Japan, at 3 years old, kids go to school independently. So there are cultural differences here. I accept they exist, but it's not a given that we can't change these things. However, I'm going to focus on one scheme only, and I think the executive member, Kate, will know what it is. The Elvington and Weldrake to Heslington cycle path. If we really want kids to get from villages to Fulford School, there's no confabulation of voluntary schemes that ever deliver that. But we do know that there's a practical stream that could deliver that. It's been costed. Sustrans produced a report for the Department of Transport. And again, this is not out of malice. This is to try and move us on. Currently, your party controls the ruling council, the 2 MPs, the Regent's Mayor, and the government. If we can't get our ducks in a row now, when will we ever get our ducks in a row? We know how much it costs to make the compulsory purchase for the particular scheme I'm familiar with. I'm quite sure knowledge exists for all the others. My question is, what can we do to officers and to the executive member? What can we do as people of all parties to give you the clout to make this step forward for our city, to persuade the region's mayor to come up with the funding to deliver a scheme, to even just start the scheme, let's be honest, on the particular cycle path I'm familiar with. But all of this is really about, if we want to change schools, if we want to change our city, sooner or later we have to stop talking about policies and data collection and just tie our futures to a handful of practical schemes that can be delivered. 18 months have already gone. I wish you well as an administration. I'm not sitting there thinking, oh God, I hope they mess up. We all know that as the months pass, we come close to that point where we're told, well, it's a bit close to the next election, I'm afraid. Probably best to wait again. And then another administration fails, as all the others have. So my question is just, what can we do to build you up so that we get past this impasse and deliver practical change in the next 2.5 years? Just get on with it.
I mean, I welcome responses. If I may just briefly, when we use words like fail, we need to remember that the funding envelope that local authorities are stuck with and in many cases ruined by, and that applied to previous administrations of your colour and other colours. But to be honest, I feel the frustration, and I'm more often than not with that frustration, and I've sent many emails in that spirit. But officers or Councillor Villiers, do you fancy responding to Councillor Vassy there? Sure.
I'll just briefly respond on this, and I'm going to generalise again rather than talk about a specific scheme, but it comes back to priorities and budget is what you're essentially pointing at, and it's absolutely fair. And this was a question I would quite like to ask the Scrutiny Committee here. We're looking now at Transport and Highways budget. We can choose to reprioritise some of that Transport and Highways budget. But what I want to feel is that we have cross-party agreement and understanding of what we're doing when we reprioritise. And there aren't many places within the transport and highways budget where we can reprioritise, because it's not a budget that has lots of bits in that can be moved around. The main bit where we can move things around is in our highways maintenance. So that's where, if we're going to reprioritise anything and find some money to put in extra pedestrian crossings, to trial a school street, to gather the data we need to gather, to purchase land, whatever needs to be done, for us as a local authority, that's where we would probably have to do some reprioritising. Yes, we can also look bigger and higher and wider, talk to the mayor, look for other funding pots, DFT. Those are all uncertainties, what ifs, maybes. The only thing that we as a local administration can control in terms of budget is our limited highways and transport budget. So I'm really interested from all of you, what do you feel, you know, in terms of our capital budget for highways and to a certain extent our revenue budget, where should we be prioritising? Is school streets, or not so school streets, is getting kids to school in whatever way something we should be reprioritising? And if so, what gets deprioritised?
Really welcome that, Councillor Avilius. That sort of honesty would go a long way, if more in the sort of public domain, because often the problem is we have this kind of conversation in scrutiny, but the moment you might talk about moving maintenance money towards, you know, getting a safe crossing somewhere, there'll be leaflets going out slagging off whoever's in charge for not filling potholes anymore, or something along those lines. So, you know, it's on all of us, if we want to make these tough decisions, to be honest about the trade-offs. Councillor Merritt, did you have a supplementary, or was it a main different question? Because I put you at the back of the queue. You're thinking about it for too long. Yeah, thank you.
It was just a comment on Christian's point. I mean, the reality is the council did do quite a lot on safe routes to school and on school travel plans and so on in the past. The data was pertinent because it was used to actually inform the travel plans. And those travel plans were then backed both with schemes to improve the safety of routes to and from school. There was also revenue aspects in terms of doing schemes which are about the hearts and minds, getting parents to be willing to facilitate their kids going to school from other, you know, by active travel means rather than by the car. And they were successful to a degree. The problem is that they needed continued funding. Originally, we put up them, when it was first introduced, we put the money up as a council. Then subsequently, local transport plans came in, monies got switched to the government funding rather than the council's own resources. And then when the plug was pulled on the government funding, the resources went. That's why I was asking the question about effectiveness and what other councils are doing, because we're going to have a tight future money-wise for the foreseeable future. So which of those schemes that councils are doing in other places are relatively low revenue impact, but relatively high effectiveness? Because we do need to understand that part of the equation if we're going to actually do something that doesn't then, in effect, lose effect a couple of years after it's been introduced. But a lot of it's about culture change, you know, and we've not in the past really had that wider culture change that has taken place in a lot of the countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and the rest of it. I think in the last few years, and the pandemic, I think particularly helped it, the situation in this country has moved a bit. I think we actually have more scope for doing that. But we really need to go back to base. I notice in the school streets guidance that actually it says the starting point is the travel plans. So I was actually going to ask if we have a clear view on, you know, what travel plans we currently have. I mean, a lot of them were introduced voluntarily by agreement with schools, but some were introduced on the back of developments at the school and are legally there under Section 106 agreements. And therefore, and those Section 106 agreements, or at least the later versions of them, require them to be periodically updated every 5 years. They probably also require the school to provide the data annually on the effectiveness and so on. Is that being adhered to by those schools at least who have the planning obligation? And how well are we doing with some of the other schools? Because I'm also conscious, the safe routes to schools that we did 20 years ago were relatively safe in that context. We now have a very different view on what are safe routes as a result of LTN 120. And a lot of what we did then is probably no longer, it's not compliant with LTN 120. I think we can take that as pretty much the base starting point. So, if you are going to do a scheme, then there's obviously, you're going to need to understand what you need to do to upgrade existing safe routes to school to achieve them. I just make a final point.
Please, and then wrap up if you can, Councillor Merritt.
Julian was suggesting we start with secondary schools. When I was on the Cycling England board and the work that we did with local authorities in rolling out bikeability, the focus was very much on primary schools, because that's the age in the second half of primary schools when kids first learn to cycle, get bikeability training and acquire the habit. And when kids, and particularly female kids, go to secondary, the use of cycling then drops off. But if you haven't got the habit before they go to secondary, you're probably not going to get absolutely nowhere. So I'm not sure that the secondary schools and the colleges is the right place to start. I think if you're going to get kids with the habit, with the proper training, safety and the rest of it, it might be better to focus on the primaries. But that's, just an observation.
I'll just come back on a couple of those, if that's right. I think where I made the comment about secondary schools was actually about providing information on safe routes to school and walking and cycling and buses. We do the bikeability training that we do is something that is ongoing now. We do that in primary schools, and I think train the vast majority of kids to the extent that it's offered in every school. Not every child takes up the offer, but we do offer it everywhere. So yeah, I accept your point, and what I was saying was specifically about providing information. I think with regard to Section 106 agreements, they will be monitored by my planning colleagues, but I can check that. With school travel plans, which were done outside of Section 106 agreements, I suspect a lot of that work has lapsed. We had, until COVID, we had a school travel plan officer who we contracted in from Sustrans, who pursued a lot of that work, as well as having somebody in-house within the council who looked after it. And we did quite a lot of work, but unfortunately we had the funding that provided for both those posts was discontinued, and the member of staff at CYC retired. So we haven't filled that post, but were we to increase activity in this area, those are exactly the kind of things that we'd be looking to do. But it makes a really important point that this is a really good example of an initiative that stands or falls to some extent on the ability of partnership working. So you've got CYC as a highways authority and looking after the highways and making sure that they're appropriate. LTN 120 is quite interesting in the sense that the reference cyclist in LTN 120 that all facilities should be designed for is a 12-year-old. So there is a clear there's a clear view in LTN 120 about what provision should be. So yeah, broadly that's the position.
Councillor Vassy, supplementary.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm listening to all the talk about the cycling safely and the schemes that are organised to help children. And And I have a degree of sympathy with it. In my ward, all the village schools, when they get to year 6, they all learn how to cycle. And you see them going round the village with a teacher, and they learn how to turn left and how to turn right. And then they go to Fulford School and none of them gets on a bike again because the roads are not safe. And even if they were safe, if you could argue that, the parents certainly don't think they're safe. So essentially, we're putting all that good effort into something and then losing it at the first hurdle. And it's a tragedy. And I think back to the way they created a cycle network in Munster, and we've heard a bit about other countries. My understanding is that in Munster, they just made the decision in the early 70s, every year they'd do 6 or 7 kilometres of cycle path. Didn't matter what else was happening, didn't matter if it joined up to the huge network. They had a vision, and they just made sure that 6 or 7 kilometres were done every year. And over a 30-year period, that transforms a city. And to respond to what Kate said, you know, yes, I think prioritising, making sure that some practical, tangible output is seen at the end of every year, and recognising that, yes, that may mean that there are some children who don't get a full period of their teaching at school. Just recognising that unless that network exists, we're essentially teaching them for nothing because they're going to give up by the time they go to secondary school. So my plea would be, and I'd be interested to see if everyone would support that or not, but that we make sure we deliver 6 or 7 kilometres of new cycle path every year, year on year. And then after 10 years, we'll be proud.
Well, if I may, supplementary to the supplementary, and it will have a question in it. And I appreciate colleagues' patience who are waiting in the main queue. One frustration I've picked up as a member over the years, and it chimes with some of what Councillor Vass is getting at, is every part of the city has its asks, whether they're school related or otherwise. And it often feels like, and I'm going to use basic numbers just to make the point, for argument's sake, there might be 50 possible schemes that the council could spend money on, like actual money, like redesigning a highway, putting a crossing in somewhere, whatever. And then of those 50, 20 are being sort of vaguely looked at. Of those 20, 10 are being properly looked at, but there's no chance that most of them will be affordable. And of those 10, 2 might just come off. But within that bigger number, I said it was 50 at the start, there's still loads of officer capacity going into looking at possibilities. And there's still a groundswell of resident energy and councillor energy that has to go in to getting these things on the list of potentials that probably won't happen. So is there not, and again, forgive my really basic way of trying to articulate this, but is there not a way of working that we can shift to where we basically say, look, all these ideas are important, but in the next year or 2 years, we're only going to deliver these 4 things in the city. The rest of you are going to have to wait. Is that not more efficient than loads and loads of maybes that probably won't come off? And if they do come off, the best they might get is a bit of new paint on the roads, because the money is being so spread across so many schemes and officer time. Do you see what I'm getting at? Can we make that shift? Is that a thing? Is it doable? Or
So there's 2 parts to this. I'll answer the first bit and then my colleague Tom will answer the second bit. So in terms of our systems, for how we decide what projects to look at and how we decide what projects to take forward, I think we have reached a place in our capital programme where there are a lot of projects which are not matched to the funding that is available to them. So projects which are not, it is not going to be possible to deliver them within the funding that we have. So we are taking forward an exercise to try and identify some of these projects and remove them from the capital plan. Now that's going to be very difficult news for some people. But you know, everybody thinks that transport is about moving stuff around. It's not, it's about money. Nature of transport is you have infinite needs to provide transport or links or buses or whatever joining, you know, people's origins and destinations of their journeys, but you have finite means to accommodate that demand. So we are embarking on a process to look at what's in the capital programme. We will have to take some very hard choices, I think, and some of it is going to be very difficult. But we are pressing on with that, and the idea obviously is it is much better to be working on delivering a dozen schemes, for instance, than having a great big long list of 80, all of which are, or many of which are progressing at a glacial pace. So Tom will say a bit about the else we're running with.
I think in a nutshell, yes, I think you're absolutely correct. So the LSWIP, the local cycling walking infrastructure plans, trying to drill down into where our sort of core priority areas are, where we're going to get the maximum benefit out of new cycling infrastructure, where we're going to get the most benefit out of walking, wheelchair user and wheeling improvements. So we've got the two different strands there, but they're definitely going to interlink because it all comes together, and then bus use into the mix as well, accessing bus stops and the like. So that will give us a plan that starts to tier off our top priority projects under cycling, top priority projects under walking, wheelchair user and wheeling, and that will split by city centre, suburban and villages, so that we're making sure the whole city's prioritised on a like-by-like basis. Once we've got that, then we need to sort of almost go into salesperson mode and be really, really hammering on the door of these funding bodies to try and get the funding in to be able to deliver the work. Because broadly speaking, there's 4 stages of designing and delivering an active travel project. You do have to do some of that feasibility work at the early stage. Really important to get that right. And that's where you might think some of the chewing around potential projects happens. But if you don't do that feasibility work well enough and to a certain level, then you don't necessarily know whether the project's a goer, whether there's a really fundamental issue with it that's going to stop you further down the line, what the cost's going to be like, so where the funding body to target is. So that feasibility level, you would throw a few more schemes than you might expect to deliver into there. But that's where we kind of have to have a realistic view that not all those might progress to the level that we might want. You then take the ones that are feasible, or the routes that are feasible, into a concept design. Make sure you do a bit more work on it then and get it to a point where you think, right, this is ready to go. We've got something that can be done here. Secure the funding, detailed design, and then delivery. And then you've got all that handover and monitoring evaluation off the back of it. But where we want to get to in an ideal, again, this is ideal, but we'll try to off the back of the LSWIP, is to be able to roll projects through that and have a proper work plan with 3 projects that's evidenced from the start of why they're needed, then into that feasibility, concept design, detailed design, delivery. That's the optimum way we want to get to. We're trying to work through with the LSWIP and the resourcing in the team to be able to do that. And if we can start to crack that, then we'll get stuff on the ground pretty quickly.
Thank you. Councillor Villiers?
Just add to that briefly that I think the way we're thinking is quite a change in the way of working, in that currently, ward councillors or local communities or parish councils will raise an issue, and then we send the team out to look at it, and then it often goes on to a long list and so on and so on. And I think it might be moving towards more of the kind of system that we have with our highway maintenance, where we have a threshold and an evidence base as to when we act on something, so that not everything automatically just goes on to a long list of things that might be done at some point in the next 3 decades. Because it's frustrating for everybody when you think something's going to be done and then it doesn't. So it's that kind of taking that approach of going out and looking at whatever's been asked, and then saying this meets the threshold where we think it needs addressing now, as we do with highway maintenance, or recognise your concerns, but there are other things that need addressing first across the city. So there will be a change in the approach if we are to implement something where we're more confident about what we're delivering and it's evidence-based and priorities focused. But again, I'm interested to hear about how people feel about that structural change in the way we approach what we deliver across the city.
Thank you, councillor Avilius. Next on my list, I've got councillor Healy.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much, councillor, because I must admit, I think you used the term honest. I was going to use the term candid. We all want to do things, but we are in a declining budget. And I think in the budget consultation, there was a proposal to take £500,000, £600,000 out of the capital budget. And given the fact that we top up our road maintenance / capital expenditure over what the government gives us, which a lot of councils don't do, I would suggest that that's a highly vulnerable area of spend. So if we are going to be redirecting monies out of an area where we already perform quite poorly, which we picked up last week, 25% of our non-principal roads need maintenance compared to a national average of 6% and the regional average of 3%. I would suggest that the rest of us need to have a reality check, as I would suggest that the cabinet member who spends much more time on this has had. So I would suggest that literally it's going to come down to, is there a funding pot available from the Department of Transport, from somewhere else, that we've got a scheme that can slot in and they can give us some money and we can deliver. I don't think that's tremendously new news to anyone. I think we've probably been doing that for a couple of years now, if not a decade. The only thing I would say is it's my understanding that there's quite a sharp, short, high morning peak of travel. It then sort of settles down throughout the day, and in the evening sort of goes up, but it's not as much, and it tends to be wider. So when we're looking to expand either 3 lunches or 3 breakfasts for schools, if a secondary criteria could be, if we're going to provide 3 breakfasts in a school and you have 2 schools equally deprived, if one of them, it would make more sense because they have more car drivers, then that might encourage parents to spread out a bit. So it's not all at 8:30, some of it might be at 8 o'clock. That's just a suggestion. I know it's a key priority and probably won't get changed, but it's just something that I think might be useful to add into the mix. So what would the question be in that? Thoughts, or my thoughts really, I suppose?
Well,
It doesn't always need an answer. Might there be any forthcoming response? It's fine if not. We can.
well, I think one of the traditional tactics for reducing transport demand, be that congestion, on public transport or on highway networks, is to try and spread demand across time. And I've got a poster at my house from the 1930s that says that from London Transport, says nothing new. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways that we could look at. I mean, interesting, the peak, sorry, I'm going to be a bit nerdy now. The peak in York is quite interesting because firstly, York is unusual in that it has a set of the peak AM flows between 7 AM and 8 AM, which is quite unusual. It's normally 8 till 9, which suggests that it's actually a preschool peak. The second is we've seen an awful lot of movement in the peak since the COVID lockdowns. There's been quite significant travel behaviour change to the extent that now the afternoon peak around school leaving time is often worse than the evening peak at the end of happens at the traditional commute time. So there's all kinds of weird and wonderful things going on there, which I think are probably just about beginning to settle down now, but it's been quite dynamic for the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay. Thank you. Next on the list, I've got Councillor Ben Burton. Thank you for your patience.
No worries, thank you. Yeah, coming to you a bit about priorities prioritisation. I mean, yeah, for me, we're fighting a losing battle across the roads. They cost a huge amount to maintain, and we don't have a budget to do that. So really, the only way we're going to get on top of them is by reducing the amount of vehicle journeys over them, so that we'd have as many repairs to do in some sense. So I'm supportive of it. I guess my only thought is I really like your idea of narrowing down to achievable goals. I work in Leeds, and I guess one thing that comes to mind is that a lot of the big transport projects there are coming through mayoral or combined authority budgets. I think one thing would be to have some big major projects that are sexy, to use the term, that attract mayoral funding, government funding, the big stuff like your cycle path or bigger changes like that we can bring in money for. And then if we're reprioritising roads funding, maybe that is for these smaller things, like where if we're doing school streets and we need to put an additional crossing, does that come from that pot of money that's been reprioritised from somewhere else? Because we're not going to attract mayoral combined authority funding or central government funding for putting in a crossing at Burnham, like we were talking about the other day. A single crossing doesn't attract a lot of investment from big parties. So I guess it's kind of two tiers of projects, one that we're funding from there and one that we're getting in from external funding. So that'd be my thoughts on that. But my question was specifically about the new enforcement rules for vehicle enforcement that are moving AMPR cameras and things like where they've done it at Waltham Forest. Is there a sense, obviously we don't get the money straight away because we've got this 6-month period and there's a capital cost up front to it, but is there a sense that because we're getting money back into the fines essentially, is there a position that this is self-funding some of these things? You know, we've looked at things like Ghent models where you're splitting up the city as well. Does the amount of fines ever start to cover the investment that we put into this? Is that something that becomes a self-funding model? I'm saying that in a good way. I'm not saying that in a bad way. So don't worry.
I think potentially it could, but I think for all of these things, they're case specific. We're not like a London borough that has, you know, a yellow box junction that results in hundreds, if not thousands, of fines every week. That you know, we simply don't have a traffic network that is under that much pressure. So yeah, maybe that it might be possible to bring some of these things in such a way that it's self-funding. My instinct in York, and part of the new local transport strategy is actually we're commissioning a piece of work to look at local transport funding and various funding sources, because that's crucial to understanding the bits of what we can do. But my instinct in York is you might achieve break even. It's never going to be a money spinner. But you know, that's just purely gut feeling, and I haven't looked through any numbers or anything like that. But I mean, I think the people of York are quite law abiding on the whole, which, while is wonderful in many ways, it means that yeah, fining regimes can sometimes not be tremendously profitable.
Councillor Villiers?
Just to really quickly add on to, I think it's a really good point you make, Councillor Burton, about separating out little things and big things. And I haven't managed to share it with the committee beforehand, but when I was having a little read around on school streets, Hackney Council has produced an excellent document, which is a how-to school streets, a toolkit. And in there, they talk about costing of school streets, and I'll happily share this with everyone afterwards. And this document was produced in 2021, so slightly out of date, but rough cost for a school street is between £5,000 and £50,000, depending on exactly what you're doing. And yeah, the amount you'll get back in terms of fines, as Julian says, is obviously uncertain, but it's something we haven't really tested in York because we haven't got cameras all over the place. So we don't know, I think. And then if you compare that to putting in a pedestrian crossing, and officers can correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're talking a similar amount, £50,000-60,000 to put in a pedestrian crossing. So it's that kind of scale of spend to do things like school streets, things like pedestrian crossings, whereas segregated cycle infrastructure or new cycle routes or that, we're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. So it's those sort of differences, and that's where, if we're looking at our budget, we could shift budget to do the smaller stuff. We can't shift within our budget to achieve some of those bigger things. That's going to have to be mayor or DFT funding.
Thank you. Councillor Waller, was that supplementary when you put your hand up? Yeah, fire away then.
Yes, it's just in response to the comments from the executive member. I am concerned about the discussion of road maintenance from this perspective of a cyclist, and particularly 12-year-old cyclist, that there are many locations where there are hazards, and the intervention depth is being applied, and it is very difficult to say that that is a safe route. And that's without any other discussion. So I would caveat that. And in terms of a climate of discussion on evidence base and saying that these schemes will be proceeded with, but those which were on the list will not be proceeded with, that is a very different climate of discussion, particularly on social media. And there just seems to be a road to Damascus approach in terms of having a debate about what progresses and what doesn't based on evidence. And that will be a very significant change in this city.
Any question, Councillor Waller, or any response to Councillor Waller's statement?
I mean, what my statement that I made earlier was to understand your feelings, not to say we are doing these things. It's to understand where everybody's priorities lie. So I appreciate what you've said, and I am listening and taking on board that feedback. Just to make it clear, I was not saying that we are going to reallocate budget from highways necessarily, or that certain schemes are going to be mothballed. It was a question of where does this committee feel it is appropriate for our priorities to lie?
And which is absolutely right. So otherwise we could sit in every single meeting and just say, I want this, I want that, and then forget that we've said it in the next meeting. There's trade-offs in every single direction. I think there's one or two supplementaries, but Councillor Stewart's been extremely patient, so I will go to you.
Not worked too often here. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so just on the the broader picture, I think from my point of view, I would definitely say we want fewer, larger, better projects. So we can all talk about how the council spends money, and worth emphasising, we've got a record budget this year. Last year was the second highest on record, the year before was the third highest on record. But obviously we have to spend things differently with adult social care, etc., education. But one of the things we're about to do as a council is we're about to have a budget consultation. We're about to blow tens of thousands of pounds, and we know full well nothing will change after the budget consultation. We know that people write in and tell us that they want less bureaucrats, more road maintenance, etc., etc. The mayor's about to do the same, blow tens of thousands of pounds on what do people want for their police, when he's going to be told we want less people sat behind desks, we want more bobbies on the beat. That's £100,000 that would effortlessly have gone onto something like building the sorts of cycle tracks that Councillor Vassie says. And I think that's where we need to be. I think we need to look at everything that we're doing and try and have these bigger wins. So rather than doing a bit of everything and a few £1,000s of leaflets which might change behaviour and everything like that, have the tangibles. So in exactly the same way that people sort of said, don't dual the Northern Ring Road because the cars will fill it. But if we build the cycle paths, then cycles will fill them. So I think that very much needs to be the focus of doing things, tangibly and in few numbers rather than large numbers. My two specific questions back on the sort of subject is, obviously, Julian, disappointed that we're not more law breaking in York. So maybe I can guess his answer to this, but I appreciate on the 6 months, we have to, we have to warn people. If we didn't have to warn people, or sort of after 6 months, and it might be a policy for the exec member, would we regard it as a good thing to warn people or not? Because I just think, from the point of view of the the ANPR type of camera, if you're breaching school offences, I think for buy-in, I'd be a lot more comfortable with people getting a warning first of all personally. I think when we had the camera car, which I wouldn't oppose at all coming back, when we had the camera car, lots of people were snapping at that and very critical, whereas I think if you've been warned, etc. So that's my question. And to Tom, you know, interesting to talk about Waltham Forest because I went to school at Peters years ago, where you're also working with, and a guy that was in my year was the executive member for education at Waltham Forest. So I think this might have been just after his time when they were doing things well, but it's quite interesting. But the point is, the biggest thing I think that will make a difference to the likes of Peters is car share. And I touched on this, you know, sort of before. I appreciate we want sustainable travel and everything like that, then it's walking, it's cycling and everything like that. But there's a lot of people, a lot of schools where you can improve the air quality. You could also improve behavioural change because, you know, saying to them, well, why don't you, you know, sort of share a lift and everything like that, less miles, you know, it's breeding a less selfish sort of way. But we don't really seem to talk about car share. And I think that will be a really, you know, think about we used to share lifts with people from all the villages around. And I think that'd be a really good, I appreciate that's not the perfect, so everyone's cycling and walking, but, you know, hopefully there's more we can do on that, I think.
No, yeah, 100% agree. We haven't really we have gone more down the active travel route in the report, but you're absolutely right, because St Peters has a broader catchment, lots of young people coming in from the villages to the north and the like, so car sharing. One of the things I'd like to do with them while the service number 2 is running down Bootham is look at some potential shuttle operation with Rockcliffe Bar Park and Ride. But there's a few other things we need to speak about on that, but that comes down to those bespoke circumstances that each school has. If it has a wider catchment where car share is appropriate, yeah, absolutely, we need to push that.
Yeah, I mean, even on some of that, you know, in Copmanthorpe, so the primary school, you know, if somebody's in, you know, sort of a few hundred meters away, they want to drive their child every day rather than risk their child, and think, you know, various parents just doing a bit of a loop round, saying, I'll pick up your kid and then, you know, pick up 3 or sort of, you know, to me, it seemed a really good solution that people would do.
It can, yeah, it can be, and I think we'd always sort of focus on that hierarchy of transport users that we've got, and you'll get a certain number of people. It might just not suit for whatever reason, or they might just not want to. At the end of the day, they might want to give the child a lift in a car, and yeah, the logical option is to get as many young people in a car as you can. Then, isn't it? It's about being pragmatic and looking at that. That's why ideally we have the resource to go into the school, speak with them and understand what's going on and talk to the parents, and then you can deliver them solutions that are right for that particular area. But yeah, broadly speaking, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and just to answer your question about warnings, I mean, I think, you know, it's like all police work, traffic enforcement is by consent. So, you know, you need to be quite careful about how you introduce it so that people don't think that they're being fined unfairly. So, yeah, I mean, you know, presumably there'll be some research behind the change. I mean, I can remember, you know, some years ago being involved in a traffic restriction where you were not allowed to issue warning letters. So there's clearly been some legislative change that's taken place for one reason or another.
Thank you. We're going to get close to wrapping up in a moment because we've covered a lot of ground here. I should say very briefly, I think it would be unfair to outright dismiss forthcoming consultations as being foregone conclusions. The cynicism I can sort of relate to, having been frustrated by systems over many years, but let's give these things a chance before we say that they're not going to make any difference. But I do agree with much of what you were saying outside of that, Councillor Stewart. I've got Councillor Healy's got 2 more questions. Councillor Vassy, was yours a supplementary? And then I'll call it there for me.
Yes, Chair, it was developing the point that had been well made by Councillor Burton about combined authority funding. And and the points made by the executive member. It would be good to get a sense of, from officers, what the part is potentially that the regional mayor and the combined authority has to enabling us to deliver these larger schemes, just to get a sense of, are there things that we need to be doing there? How do we access the funding? Councillor Revillis has been very clear that the pots that are available that we're talking about are not the same pots that could deliver these schemes. So getting clarity about where that money is, how we would get it.
So I keep coming to these meetings and saying funding is a total enigma at the moment. You know, this time last year we were told we'd have large amounts of money coming to us from the cancellation of HS2. We have no idea whether that is still going to come or not, what conditions could be placed on it, how it would be administered, whether it would go to us or mayor, how it might be divided up between various different funding pots. And actually that position is not really any different now. I think we are expecting a national integrated transport strategy pretty imminently, which might provide some more information on this. Obviously, the mayoral combined authority and its powers will be set out in, I think, the devolution bill, which I understand is part of this parliamentary session. So I think we look to engage with wherever we can access funding as that rolls forward. But at the moment, it's not clear where that will be. I mean, you can imagine that the mayor will probably have a larger role than anticipated, but it's, that you would struggle to find somewhere where that's written down. We are working with the mayor at the moment. We've got some money from the mayor to progress a number of our transport initiatives. So far, so we've obtained funding to develop the movement place plan a bit further, and we've also obtained some funding to take forward EV charging and provide EV charging infrastructure. So we are working with the combined authority. We know their systems. That there's probably a bit of an opportunity because there is money to be had there, but it's an emerging picture. I mean, I think Councillor Burton, I think, said something very useful, which was talking about Leeds. The crucial difference between Leeds and York and North Yorkshire is that through the City Regional Sustainable Transport Settlement, Leeds City Region has a multi-year capital funding settlement and has also got other sources of funding. So it's got some money for because of the cancellation of the Polybus proposals there. That is a very different funding place to be in to the one that York has historically been in. Now, I could be sitting here in 3 months' time saying how wonderful it is that we now have a multi-year funding settlement which allows us to make some real progress against some of these objectives. Now, I don't know whether that will come through or not. Obviously, it would make all our lives in transport much, much easier if it did. I mean, historically, we've been quite reliant on bidding for funds. You can only bid for funds which are available for specific things. I would say we've done quite well, and that's the reason why we have an electrified bus network and we have large amounts of the stuff going on, but it's not guaranteed. So it's really emerging. I mean, I'd say that my career in transport goes back about 25 years now, and this is the time when there has been least certainty about funding over that period. At any other time, I've been working with Councillor Villis on the transport strategy, and 5 or 10 years ago, we could come up with a list of schemes that we wanted. We say, right, we'll approach DFT for those ones we can fund internally, and so on and so forth. We can't do that at the moment. Now, hopefully that will come to an end soon, but at the moment, there's just a massive amount of uncertainty.
Thank you for that. I will stick with what I said about drawing a line after Councillor Healy's 2 questions, because we've been on this for well over an hour now, which is plenty. Councillor Healy.
Thank you, Chair. My son Samuel goes to St Olives, and we're just under the 2 miles, so we have to get him there ourselves. So I approached the council and said, well, look, you put on the home to school transport that my daughter was able to access, but Sam couldn't. And I was told that each trip was over £24. And I thought, well, actually, I thought it was going to be cheaper for the council than it would be if I organised it myself. Now we've lost the chair. So I was going to say it might be worth doing a deep dive either as a topic group or as a later item into just why that's so expensive. Because £24 for a single trip for a single child seems very high. Second point was, so I now take him on the bus, catch the number 7 from the town centre out to Fulford. And we used to sit upstairs because, you know, little kids like to sit upstairs. After multiple occasions of having to tell children to A, stop swearing, and B, stop vaping, for his comfort, as well as theirs, as well as mine, I then sat downstairs with all the adults. So on the number 7 bus in the morning, upstairs is full of kids who are, I don't know, 12, 13, 14, 15, that kind of age, in uniforms, and downstairs are all of the adults. Now, if I had a car, which I'm quite unusual in not having a car, I would not catch the bus. So there are downsides to using the hierarchy as expressed. So it's too far to walk. It's too far to really cycle. Actually, it's not, but I'd have to buy a cycle. So we catch the bus, but the bus is not a pleasant experience if you have to share it with morning children. So you missed that, Chair.
It's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube, yeah. Pick it up. No. But the £24, I was very surprised it was that expensive. And I really would quite like to dig into just why it is that expensive.
That's presumably a taxi.
It's a taxi, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, that highlights something that's quite important, actually, which is some of the wonderful work that's being done by our education colleagues in the school transport department of the council. They're doing lots of work to help young people travel independently, so fewer of them have to use more expensive taxi provision, so they are able to use bus services. So that, you know, there is work, and it's good for a whole variety of reasons, including increasing independence of young people. So we are aware of that, and we do take steps towards it. Now, it's not, you know, the nature of transport. As I said, there are infinite numbers of possible combinations of possible origins and destinations of trips, and it's not to say that that particular trip is one that isn't covered by bus services. So, you know, without knowing more about the personal circumstances, I couldn't say.
My personal trip is covered by a bus service. It's just the fact that it is just so expensive. And that's per trip as well. So to get him, well, to get my daughter from our house to school and back again is £48 a day.
Yeah, but that can't be a bus.
No, that's a taxi.
Yeah, it's a taxi. But if it's covered, yeah, by a bus, then if it's covered by a bus, then I suppose it's a question about why it isn't taking place in a bus.
Okay, well, I'm gonna have to explain this longer. My daughter did get access to the council provided taxi service to school and back again. She's now gone on to secondary school. My son has now taken that same provision because they're both dyslexic and they go to this dyslexia school.
Yeah,
he was not eligible for the taxi because I no longer needed to take my other sibling to a school that was completely in the other opposite direction. So I then asked them, well, can I buy into your service? Because it's probably going to be cheaper for me to buy into it than it is for me to purchase a taxi myself. That's when I found out that it costs £24 per trip. So it's, the situation is perfectly valid. It's following process and we now catch the bus, which is fine. I would like to know, either from a subgroup or another topic later on, just why it's so expensive. Because it sounds like per trip, a figure's been arranged almost no matter how close or how far or how many kids they put in the car, it's £24. And I understand that across the country, this is a very expensive area of provision. From where I sit, I would struggle to come up with why that would be £24 per trip per child.
Well, I mean, it's a specific thing, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with it.
So is this something we could take offline?
Yes, I mean, it could be, yeah.
Okay.
That might free up some cash for some of these other school-based programs.
Indeed. I will wrap that up and move to recommendations if I may. I know, I mean, I've held back on questions I wanted to ask, but you know, time is time. In terms of possible recommendations, I'm open to ideas. I mean, there's been some put forward in the paper for sort of future program of work. I think, well, reading the committee, I think there's possibly a consensus around a recommendation to the executive member to find ways of working so that we're working on fewer schemes that are sort of delivered in a more timely fashion to a better extent. I've not worded it very well there, but this conversation we're having around getting things done that are tangible and not getting lost with so many possibilities with very few actually happening. I mean, there's a steer there to the exec member and officers. And any issues with that, Councillor Waller?
Thank you. I think in terms of recommendations, we had previously talked about the information gathering from individual schools, and I think that would need to be worked in to this, because some of them will come up with things that are readily possible within the existing programme. Others are bigger, but I think for you to understand individual cases, it would be helpful for a long-term view of understanding what they are interested in from their perspective.
Thank you, Councillor Waller. Councillor Merritt?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I was going to suggest perhaps the first thing that we ought to say is we feel this area of travel to school work is an important potential priority for our transport plan and for funding, because if we are to significantly shift the way people make journeys, we've got to start with our kids. We've got to start, making sure they can do them in the right way as they grow up, and obviously, hopefully, bring their parents with them, so to speak. So I think that would be a first useful statement. I think the second one is we should be taking a strategic approach on this, not just doing the odd school because there's pressure here. And I think that also comes back to the issue of funding. I don't see why, if we are contemplating putting in bids to the mayor for safe routes, the capital side, I don't see why we shouldn't actually be going with a more comprehensive bid, which is about the whole package of what we want to do in terms of getting kids to and from school. So it's both capital and revenue. And my recollection is the mayor's budget actually has more flexibility on revenue and capital than our own by a significant margin. So I think we should be doing that more conference. Christian was absolutely right about what made the difference in a lot of those our comparator countries in Northern Europe. I mean, I remember I visited Munster in the 1990s, and their budget for cycling schemes was 3 times the entire city council capital budget for all highway schemes.
So, Councillor Merritt, how would you succinctly summarise that second recommendation?
Yes, yeah. As I say, that we would support an approach for a strategic bid to cover both the revenue and capital aspects of changing how we get kids to and from school.
Thank you. Councillor Stewart?
I'm just looking forward to reading the minutes where we've got fewer schemes as number one, and then the second recommendation, every aspect of the. No, can I suggest that I think Councillor Merritt's point about getting in a specific mayoral bid, I'm happy with that. What I would potentially suggest is, reflecting the view that we look at secondary rather than primary, because secondary, obviously, as Julian said, I think it was Julian. There's a lot fewer schools. You don't get the sort of Councillor Vassy issue of, taught one way to behave at primary school and then it sort of goes at secondary school. At secondary school, a 15-year-old or something like that is far more likely to be able to be cycling on their own and everything like that than obviously a 6-year-old. And for me, I would say secondary is where we can make more of an impact than primary. So that would be my particular suggestion, which may or may not be agreed with, in the scheme of fewer things and more finite resource. I think if we're doing every school, we're going to be into loads and loads of micro solutions about some very, very small schools. You might find sort of Ascombe Richard, where I grew up, is particularly enthusiastic, but it's a tiny, little school in the context of things. And, the way resources are spread, I'd go for secondaries.
Councillor Merritt?
Just a point of clarification, I wasn't suggesting we do every school.
Mm.
What I meant by a strategic approach is that we in effect do perhaps 2 or 3 schools a year, but we do it in a comprehensive way as part of a strategic long-term approach. So there's a pot of money each year, very much along Christine's line, a sizable pot of money that will enable us to do quality schemes and knock off schools, a couple a year over an ongoing long-term period, so that over time we do sort the whole picture.
I mean, I would still see more bang for our buck in going for secondary first rather than primary.
Okay, I mean, I wouldn't be minded to sort of back a focus on secondary on the grounds that I prefer, or I lean towards the idea of getting good habits into people earlier on in their lives. I accept the issue that comes with that cut-off point between primary and secondary, but if members see it differently, I'm open. Councillor Vassy?
I have a lot of sympathy with what has been said about the secondary school thing. One of the things, as I said earlier, that guts me is how many primary school children are given the opportunity to learn how they could be citizens using active travel, and then it's cut off when they go to secondary school. So I think if we could spend a little time focusing on trying to improve that access to safe cycling for secondary schools, it would pay dividends. So I share the comments that have been made there.
Councillor Merritt?
Just on that point, I think it might be a bit of horses for courses. I absolutely took what you said about Weldrake and Strensall, but in the main urban area, there is more chance that you can actually keep kids currently cycling from when they leave primary, when they go to secondary. But the issue with girls is much more a cultural thing, and whether they want to be seen on a bike or not, rather than other aspects. So if we were able to get a package that does 2 or 3 schools a year, then it might be a package that has 1 secondary, but a couple of the feeder primaries for that school. It will be overlap in terms of the safe routes, and in that sense you might get more bang for your bucks if you take that sort of approach.
Okay, we really do need to wrap this item up. Councillor Healy?
Super quickie. Can we just leave it at schools? And if we are going to move to a system where it's more process driven, like road maintenance, as opposed to ad hoc, then the schools, be they secondary or primary, will just naturally filter out. It's just, I'm aware that secondary schools don't tend to have catchment areas anymore, so it's very difficult to pick your main routes, whereas at least primary schools do have catchments.
Yeah, I'm with you. Councillor Stewart?
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 super quick points. I think on the habit making, my point would be that as a primary school, it's not the kids making habits, it's the parents doing a set thing. If you think about, if you're eating sweets as a 5-year-old, you're eating sweets your parents have let you have. If you're eating sweets as a 13-year-old, that is your habit. But secondly, just in terms of finite resources, there's obviously potentially going to be academies involved in this. And so if we look at how we can get the best for our money, there might be an academy that is absolutely jumping on this and saying, yeah, we'd love to work with you on this. Or if you go to someone like St. Peter's and say to St. Peter's, look, we've got next to no money as an authority, they're likely to have more money than a lot of schools. So, you know, again, you can make more of a difference potentially there, particularly in terms of getting what the exemplar is for what you can then roll out elsewhere across the city. Thank you, Chair.
So that's about the latter point, sort of working with academies to effectively access funding, possibly. Or,
If the academy's keen, so if it, you know,
yeah.
XYZ Academy says, yeah, we'd love to do this, therefore, you know, we'll give you 7 hours a week of this person's time, then they go to the top of the queue compared to an academy that says, well, yeah, we'll leave it.
I mean, it's a recommendation, you know, it's not necessarily a game changer, but yeah, I think we could put that forward. I think Councillor Merritt's two suggestions capture the essence of the general discussion. And Julian?
If I may say so, this is where working with the schools to do school travel planning is essential in determining your priorities, because actually that's probably the way you do it, rather than having a blanket, we'll only do primaries or we'll only do secondaries or we'll concentrate on academies or whatever. In reality, we've done this before. You focus your efforts on the places which engage most and give you your best, give you the best comeback. And, you don't necessarily worry too much about what those individual schools are. So I think that's probably, you collect the data and you start doing the school travel planning and interacting with schools, and you get a feel pretty quickly for the ones where, you're pushing it more of an open door. I think the other thing is simply because of the way that Europe is laid out, you've got some clusters of schools. I mean, the most obvious one is a cluster of All Saints and Millthorpe. So you've got a very, very large number of, because schools don't have catchments, but they do have locations. So there are common access routes for a lot of schools. And, there is obviously along Tadcaster Road, you've got your college at one end of it, your drinking houses halfway down it, Millthorpe. At the end of it, all three excellent schools which have contributed to my education. And then you've got All Saints by Mudgate Bath. So, there are clusters where, you can focus efforts to.
Thank you. I feel like we'll keep going round and round even more than we already have. I'm comfortable enough with Councillor Merritt's two recommendations. I think they capture as much consensus as we can have without getting into too much detail. I wish we had more time to go into this even more. But we'll draw this item to a close if that's all right. But very grateful for your time, officers, and Councillor Villiers. I'm sure this one will come back to this committee in the future. Did you want to say something? Sorry.
One last word is that I really appreciate everyone's thoughts here. And I think when we are in a place of having a bit more clarity around funding and priorities, then it might be really useful to have a task and finish group, if that's of interest, to help pin down the wheres and the hows we do this. So just putting that out there as an offer later in the stage.
Yeah. Thank you. Always of interest. Capacity is always the challenge, but yeah, we can get that down on the wish list, as it were. Thank you very much. We'll jump straight into the next item, if we may. If anyone needs the loo, help yourselves. Councillor Healy, you've got to dash, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so we're on our next item. So the officers and executive member who've joined the table. I'm very grateful for your patience. That I thought we were making good time, and then that item just got very loose. But for information, for those watching at home or those unsure, this item is an update on the council's recycling. So that's with regards to household recycling and other forms of recycling across the city. If officers want to introduce themselves and give a brief overview of the paper, we can take it as read. That would be wonderful. And again, thank you for your patience. It's appreciated.
Great, thanks very much, Chair. I'm Ben Grobban, Head of Environmental Services.
I'm Julie Dunn, Environmental Services Officer.
Becky Copley, Business Manager for Environmental Services.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to come and present to you this evening. Just a few points I'll probably make in relation to the report. Obviously, Waste Services provides a waste and recycling service across all 92,000 households across the city. Predominantly, the service is an alternate week collection service at most households via wheeled bins for household waste and boxes for recycling. There are some differences for members to be aware of, which I've covered within the report. Obviously, we have a lot of communal bins at flats and houses multiple occupation, where there are kind of shared facilities for residents to use, and within the city centre, where there are some very awkward access arrangements. We have a service provided by St Nick's, who provide a recycling service to just over 2,500 properties in the city centre. Across the last number of years, there has been an increase in the amount of materials that have been added to the curbside collections, specifically around an expansion of mixed plastics, foil, and also worth noting that obviously paper and cardboard is now one of the most lucrative markets for recycling, and it's obviously important to keep this material separate from other materials that are recycled. In terms of our own vehicle fleet as a council, that's been totally transformed over the past 3 years. We've moved to split pack vehicles for recycling away from the old 3-compartment vehicles that we used previously. The new vehicles are narrower, so again have fewer access issues and a better service delivered to households. In relation to garden waste, as you'll all be aware, the curbside garden waste service has been delivered in York since October 2005, and that service transitioned to a opt-in subscription service from August of this year. In terms of participation, we've achieved 39,301 subscriptions, take up of around about 59%. And the garden waste collection service is actually moving into its last 2 weeks of service, with the last collection being next Friday, the 6th of December. In terms of the report, section 5 of the report highlights some of the recent recycling campaigns that have been undertaken to seek to drive an increased recycling. Obviously referring to the recycling journey on the council's website, participation in every can counts. Obviously new curbside recycling flyers that have been issued, and the development of a waste newsletter, which now has over 33,000 subscribers, which is fantastic. Section 6 of the report shows performance over the past 10 years for both household waste and recycling, and you'll notice that in that period both household waste tonnages and recycling tonnages have come down, whilst the number of households have gone up. One of the reasons for this is that on the whole the waste industry is based on weight metrics, and as packaging has changed, both in a reduction of packaging or that the packaging itself has got lighter, it does have an impact on the amount of material handled. In terms of section 7 and 8 of the report, that focuses on the number of ways in which residents can recycle outside of the curbside scheme, obviously such as the provision of bring banks across the city, obviously our household waste recycling centres at Hazel Court and Southall, our recycling offered through St Nick's, the bulky waste collection service offered by the council, which is obviously a charge service. In terms of section 10 of the report, that focuses on some of the recycling and rebate values. What I would say in relation to that is that it is very much a fluctuating market, and rebates and indeed demand for product has been affected by a number of situations outside of obviously council control, but obviously, you know, even things like the conflict in the Ukraine has an impact in terms of the availability of recycling and also some of the recycling markets. In terms of the future, the government have outlined some reforms as part of a simpler recycling. These reforms are starting to be delivered from April of next year and affect not only households but also businesses. And as recently as last week, the government have announced that they are going to go ahead with a DRS, a deposit return scheme, in England. But at the same day, the Welsh government announced that they're actually shelving plans to introduce a DRS scheme. One of the things that I just wanted to emphasise is that obviously all of our household waste as a city, and indeed all of the household waste from North Yorkshire, goes over to Allerton Park for treatment, and that's a three-stage treatment. There's a recycling process at the front end, an anaerobic digestion process, and also the incineration process at the final stage. So as a council, we actually have a dispensation not to introduce food waste, which is part of the simpler recycling reforms, and that dispensation is in place until 2043. Section 12 of the report outlines some ideas that the service would recommend in terms of options and ways in which we can seek to further enhance recycling performance, but we'll obviously welcome firstly questions from the committee, and then also any alternative recommendations that you may wish to add or change to those that are in the report. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ben. Very much appreciated, and welcome the quite wide-ranging report also. I have a couple of questions to get us started, and then I'll invite those from colleagues. This question might be a little bit out there and potentially premature, but the report mentions that the household waste recycling centres are close to capacity. I'm thinking very, very, very big picture here. But as the city grows, are we going to need another one? I know we've closed one in the last, well, decade or just over a decade. Is that something that's being looked at very early on, loosely? Yeah, I've got nods, but go on.
Yeah, it's a valid point, Councillor. Yes, I think in relation to the household waste recycling centres, then obviously there are questions as the city continues to expand and grow, and more properties are due to be built, that there potentially may be a need to look at additional provision or alternate provision in terms of the sites themselves. In relation to the two sites that we have, I suppose in terms of expansion, we'd be very limited in what options are available.
Right.
I think from a wider perspective, there is potential to look at an operating depot, and obviously we've currently got the operating depot at Hazel Court. But as again the city continues to grow, there will become a point in time at which that depot, you know, potentially may need to be expanded or even relocated. So as part of that work, there is a project board that's currently set up to have a look at some options for a green energy park, and as part of that we will look at household waste recycling centre provision as part of that project.
Thank you. Interesting. My other question is totally unrelated, but one of the doorstep grumbles we sometimes get, and you've sort of touched on this in the paper, is why should I bother separating my recycling when it all gets chucked into the same truck in the same compartment? Now I know this is a minority of cases, but does it happen in the same parts of the city more often than not? I know there's communal blocks, but in sort of areas of terraced housing or other types of housing, is it the same parts of the city that tend to get that all-in-one experience? And if so, are they getting messages to reassure them that the waste is still being separated?
I think there's two elements to that. There are people who genuinely do have previously had their waste mixed. And then there is the misconception of what we do with the assistance bins that the crews use. The crews have two bins. Generally one's blue, one's orange, and they put all the paper into one blue bin and all the plastics and cans into the orange bin. Residents often perceive this as they've chucked it all in one bin. And that's not the case. Where we have had instances of the genuinely mixing waste, that was due to a vehicle limitation that we had. We didn't have an appropriate vehicle. That's no longer the case, and we are able to do that. And we're actively working on communicating with the people who have previously received, have been serviced by the vehicle that did collect them collectively, to communicate with them to make sure that they are aware that they should be separating their materials out into the correct streams.
Thank you.
Well, just saying, in addition to that, everything that Becky said is completely right. There is a separate piece of work that is referred to within kind of sections 12.3 and 12.4 of the report in terms of that survey of communal bins. So currently that is an area where for operational reasons, we have certain properties that are serviced by our commercial waste round to reduce the amount of vehicles going into the city centre, for example. So what we have to look at, or the option to look at, whether or not we can actually increase that source separation so that we can get those bins emptied separately, so we're not having to commingle some of the waste, and we can actually ensure that paper and card, for example, is kept separate from plastics in those particular locations, so that we can actually seek to almost replicate the household service across that commercial operation. Now, as I say, we do make some of those visits to actually reduce the amount of traffic flow going into the city centre, for example. But if we can look at times today in which we can make some of these collections, we can make that improvement, and that's one of the recommendations that's referred to within the report.
And those residents are probably unaware that we're doing that.
Sure.
Because it's not a doorstep service for them.
Yes.
Because it's communal bins.
Okay, thank you. I've got hands, Councillor Bember and then Councillor Waller.
Yeah, thanks. It's kind of supplemental to this. So just on the, so that makes sense. I'm trying to work out in the report why, so it's kind of like place, I guess, like on game where you're going to do a commercial round and then you just got to pick up ones there. That makes sense. Why do the commercial ones, or why are they all in one? Why are they not asked to separate their waste?
Yeah. Again, and it's a very good question. In terms of, I suppose, legislation, currently businesses don't have to recycle. There's not a duty. So as a household, we have local authority, you have a statutory duty to collect at least 2 forms of recycling from residents at the curbside. In relation to a business, I could open a business tomorrow. I could ring up another waste provider, hopefully, obviously, the council's commercial waste service, and ask for 1 bin. And I can mix all of the waste in that bin. It's entirely down to me as a business owner. From April of next year, there are going to be increasing reforms coming in for businesses in terms of how they manage their waste. So the first change is going to be for those businesses that generate food waste and are over a particular size. So if they have 10 FTE employees or more, they are going to be forced to separate food waste and present that separately from their other waste. As the years move forward, so as we get closer to 2030, that requirement is going to fall upon more businesses. Now, there are, I would say, a number of questions that still need to be answered by government through legislation in terms of how are they going to enforce about these businesses, what about businesses that have a lack of storage space, which would be particularly pertinent for a number of businesses in York. So some of that further detail is yet to be fleshed out and communicated, but there is going to be a greater emphasis on businesses recycling and separating their waste like households do. So I think there's an opportunity for us as a service to make sure that we're offering that tailored service, and at the same time, we can seek to maximise the recycling that we collect from some flats and HMOs at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Waller next.
Thank you. Yeah. The point that was raised about the public separating their waste, their recycling, and then seeing it mixed is something that has come up a lot. And it has been frustrating that really the next generation of recycling system has been dependent on the government making up its mind what it is. It's going to ask local authorities to collect. I think getting clarity that the anaerobic digester at Alton Park does mean that we don't have to introduce a separate food waste collection, because why collect it to send it to a different anaerobic digester? But it certainly needs communication, and tonight we're being asked about recommendations for public consultation going ahead. So I think it's about bringing the public with us, and that I think is important. We were asked what they wanted to do, and they wanted to get rid of these when we collected. There's a few in my shed. We collected paper and cardboard in these, and they were forever lying around. So I think the move to boxes, and I think 20 years ago, moving to boxes, if we said they'll still have them in 20 years' time. So I think it's really about responding to the issues about plastic bottles blowing about when there's a storm overnight and people put the stuff out, and not that you don't put them. You're not issuing nets anymore, because that is another question that we get. Oh, well, I've lost my nose. Where do I get them from? So I think it's about developing a system that's readily understandable about what is happening to the recycling that I put out, appreciating that things are different for paper and cardboard, because that's what happens to it next. And I think that aspect of people wanting to recycle more items, but the range of plastics has increased, and that was always a bugbear. Well, why can't I put yogurt pots in? Why can't I put this in? The vast variety of different types of plastic and what you do with it, because you need someone to do something with the material that you collect. So that I think needs to be part of the consultation, is that people are very interested from a very young age to what happens. So I think that needs to be factored into the consultation. And so the other question is, when is the Christmas collection calendar coming out? People been asking me. Been asking everybody.
We've been batting it back and forth all day. As soon as possible.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of that, I completely take everything on board that you said there, Councillor, and we'll obviously include that in obviously any recommendations that come forward, and build that into the recommendations on the consultation. In terms of Christmas waste, all of the graphics have been finalised. That's what I was working on as you were discussing the previous item. So all of that will be communicated out as soon as possible. There will be press releases going out. There'll be information on the website. Obviously, all of the collection calendars will be updated. Information through various channels, social media, parish councils, leaflets will be coming around, or posters will be coming around to yourselves as elected members. So there's an entire communications campaign that's being put together around the Christmas collections, and that will be communicated to members in the coming week.
Thank you. Councillor Hook, was that supplementary or?
Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, it would just be great to get that thing you said about the red and the blue bins. That would just make it so much clearer to members of the public who are confused about the mixing of waste.
Yeah, we've done a communication on it before previously, but we've not done it for a little while. So yeah, we can pick that back up again.
Yeah.
One of the suppose areas that we are looking at the moment, and we do have to be slightly careful as a local authority in terms of accessibility, but it's about putting graphics and on videos and so on and so forth on the web. But that's one of the things that Becky's working with web services team on at the minute, is to make that more human, I think, in terms of what happens to the waste. Even if it's something, you know, like filming a video that clearly shows that the vehicles have two compartments and that they actually get ejected separately, you know, so we can work with your waste about doing some kind of filming on site, because again, that's something that we can look to improve that more human message, I think.
Thank you. Supplementary, Councillor Vassie?
Yes, Chair. Just responding to what you've just said there, during COVID, I produced a video for the council on how things were actually recycled. If it's of value, I'd be happy, pardon me, to work, to volunteer to help those who might need to see how to do that, because I personally believe passionately that a 1 minute film can do what 40 pages of report can't do. Just practically show people how things are done.
Yeah.
So I'd be more than happy to play that part.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'll certainly take you up on that offer outside of tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Vassie. Next, I've got Councillor Merritt.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I have some trivial minor questions, but also one bigger question later. The page 44, the plastic film packaging and plastic bags, etc., that are going to be coming as part of the government's requirements. Some explanation of what those different terms are, and it would be quite useful as and when you next happen to be here. But more particularly, the bigger question, obviously, is how well these things are going to be labelled, particularly for films where they get torn up and those sorts of things. You know, even with the existing, it's often quite difficult. You look at plastic items, and sometimes you can just see the triangle, but it's so tiny that the number in it you can't read. Or that one part of a 2-part container has a label, but the other part doesn't, and looks slightly different. So is it the same material or isn't it? You know, so labelling is absolutely crucial to make this work. So is the government, has it already legislated, or is it going to legislate to require good readable labels that give us a fair chance of actually, you know, and the public a fair chance of doing what we're asking them to do? So that was one of my questions. The bigger question I wanted to ask later is the Annex 2, which shows comparative recycle rates. Our neighbour, East Riding, manages to recycle more than half again, as much per person as we manage to recycle. What are they doing differently? Is it because they're including big items that we're not doing at the moment? And what's the issues that allow them to do it that don't allow us to do it? If that's okay.
Yeah, if I may, I know Becky and Jodie have been doing some work on this, so I'll let them answer the bit about East Riding first, and I'll come back to your question about labelling.
East Riding have a number of differences in their collection system to ours. They have a garden waste collection that runs throughout the year, which also is used to collect food waste. So obviously gives a large tonnage. Their recycling is done in bins, 240 litre blue bins, and you can have 2 if you want. So obviously, again, the tonnages are very high on that. And that gives quite a different aspect to what we provide. And they also have quite a strong enforcement policy, which is worth mentioning, because it's sort of like a 2 strikes system where your recycling bin is tagged if you have contaminants in it. And then you are tagged again if it's believed to happen again. And then you're moved across to a clear bag system for 3 months with a letter, i.e. your bin is taken off you if you're not using it correctly. And there's quite a lot of input from officer and operations teams to enforce policy of having very good quality recyclers.
Yeah, they knock on the door, they talk to the resident, they tell them there's a problem, explain what the problem is. It's a very involved process. What we don't know is how much staff and resource they have. They have a higher population than we do. They've got about 143,000.
Yeah, 164,000 households and obviously a higher population of
So
343,000.
we don't know the size of their team and how much, they've got in terms of back office and staff to do this. But they would rather you didn't recycle at all if you can't do it well. And they're very firm on that stance.
Thank you. I have.
Sorry, just to
No,
come
no.
back on that, in terms of, what the team have said, is completely right in relation to East Riding. When the simpler recycling reforms first came out in terms of a consultation, they currently mix their food waste and garden waste and treat that through investment composting. Under the initial proposals, that was actually going to be outlawed under the new simpler recycling reforms. However, the final iteration of the scheme actually backtracked on that, and it actually is going to continue to allow that, which was a change from the first two consultations that came out. In relation to the question that you've asked about labelling of products, completely correct to ask that, and it really is a significant issue. As part of extended producer responsibilities, the government have outlined that they are going to change the labelling requirements upon producers to make it clearer for, obviously, for all of us as residents on what can and can't be recycled and how it can be recycled. Again, one of the things I would probably say is missing at the moment is the fine detail behind that. It's not yet released, but it's certainly a question that we're keen to understand as obviously officers and obviously we need to get that message communicated across to residents as well.
Yeah, what I would say is we try to make the information as accessible and understandable as possible in the simplest of terms. So for example, when we started recycling plastic, we just told people that we recycled plastic bottles and we didn't go into the types of plastic because it's an industry standard stream. But so now we do give plastic types about what you can recycle, but sometimes we try to explain that as no dark coloured plastic. And that's sometimes a lot easier for people to understand that this is light grey and it's a ready meal tray. It hasn't got a PPE mark on it. What we'll say is we don't recycle dark plastic, black plastic, and that communicates the message better than trying to look for a tiny label sometimes. So we do try to make it digestible for people.
I think I've got supplementaries there from Councillor Ben Burton. And
Yeah,
Councillor
thanks.
Lassie.
Yeah, I thought it's my only question I had on the spot was around enforcement. Because obviously the countries that do best at recycling, as well as having other schemes, do just generally have quite strong enforcement policy. So it's interesting to hear that East Riding do more of that. Obviously, some councils, we seem to have pretty limited options for enforcing with fines, which would obviously generate some income towards actually having enforcement teams and stuff. But is it something we are exploring in terms of increasing enforcement or approach to enforcement, or is that something that's currently not on the table? What's our appetite for that, I guess, as a council?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something we do need to look at as a council. In relation to I suppose an approach to enforcement, I think as part of the kind of budget proposals for this year, there are some proposed changes around how that community safety stroke enforcement function may be perhaps resourced in the future. So I think it's important for that to come out as part of those proposals. But as I say, there's not much detail that we've got on that yet as a team. So Councillor Kent, have anything?
Just briefly to say that I mean, that is a live issue, isn't it? That how much capacity we have to enforce, but also we recently adopted, just as a council, a new enforcement policy, which is always sort of not softly, but we warn, we negotiate, and prosecuting or fining is the last resort on most issues, not on sort of instant littering. But I think that would probably also apply to this. Is that fair to say?
We work very closely with the neighbourhood enforcement teams in areas where we have problems with waste, littering, bins left out, that kind of thing. they do have powers to fine people and take them through legislation. They find it's not very effective and it doesn't come to anything, especially with areas with high traffic in terms of turnover, students, commuters, they're in and out. And by the time they get somebody to court, they get them to they've gone, they've moved, they've disappeared. So they don't find it helpful or useful to, we tend to use the method of carrot and stick rather than, you know, beating them with it. We want to use encouragement and, you know, help people to do things rather than punish them. So whilst we're interested to see how they do this with east riding, for example, we're interested, but we're not we're not saying that we're going down that path as yet.
Councillor Kemp?
So just to follow that up, I know one of the very successful things that you implemented when we implemented the charge for the garden waste was when people hadn't subscribed but put out, they got sort of one warning or one free collection. They put one out after the charge was implemented, and then if they did it again, they got an oops sticker, which was a sort of friend. It wasn't a sort of corporate. It wasn't difficult. It was very understandable. And we had a conversation. We've had conversations, haven't we, about using that kind of approach, saying, "Oops, you've put the wrong recycling out," and just to sort of really highlight it. But it's not enforcement with a fine, but it's sort of behaviour change messaging.
Councillor Vassy, you had a supplementary. Are you? Well, you'd be next in line anyway, so fill your boots.
Thank you, Chair. Well, we'll kind of say it was partly supplementary. No, I'm very interested in what was said about commercial waste. For 3 years, I was a product designer with a company in the city centre and was very acutely aware of the problems to do with collecting waste and everything being thrown in together. So my question around that is whether you feel you've got the necessary things in place to be able to seize the commercial opportunity. Because I think there are a lot of businesses out there who would like to do things better. And it's a question of presenting them with a way of making that leap and then enabling them to badge and flag up to other people that they are on the right side of history. And sometimes I think we put in place opportunities, but don't recognise that for business they need to jump up and shout and say, look, we're doing the right thing. So I hope that that's being thought through, and to kind of round it up and again to relate to the words that have been said about plastics, because that was very much part of what I got involved with. As has been said, there are dozens of types of plastics and only a few of them recycled. What's also very clear in the commercial world is there's this massive difference between when people say something's recyclable or biodegradable or compostable. They all mean completely different things in technical terms, but are used interchangeably by business to suggest to the public that they're doing the right thing when they buy products that are actually not recyclable, or that are plastic that can only be recycled in 2 factories in the entire world, or that bamboo cups are recyclable when they contain melamine, which itself contains formaldehyde, which if you put it on a compost heap is not going to do anyone any favours. So the messaging is always so complicated. And I recognise that, and I recognise in the words you've said here, where you said, I think there was something about you could recycle PE as long as it was larger than 50 millimetres by 50 millimetres. I suspect the public have long given up before they get that far. So my key point, though, is I'm really pleased to hear that the commercial waste stuff is now open to change, and I hope that you'll really seize the opportunity and do well from it. In persuading city centre businesses to switch to you.
Yeah, thank you for what you said, Councillor Vassy, and it is something that we are actively working on at the moment in terms of not only our offer to our current customer base, but also looking at what options and opportunities exist for us as part of these changes. Allied to that, I think it's without kind of breaking any kind of commercial, confidentiality, that there do need to be discussions between ourselves, North Yorkshire and Your Waste, about how we all work for the greater benefit of the city and the region. And those conversations are happening, but obviously we're focusing in the immediate term on the kind of businesses, and we've got 1,500 customers of our commercial waste service, and it's about helping those customers understand what the changes mean for them as businesses, which is the process we're working through now, and then obviously looking at how we can maximise our opportunities as we move forward.
If I can just respond very quickly, Chair.
Very quickly.
You mentioned about paper and cardboard being a profitable area of what you're doing. One of the great tragedies in the city centre is when you see businesses who are receiving cardboard boxes every day, then mixing that up with plastic and other rubbish and the tapes and so on and so forth. That potentially would seem to be a great money spinner. So I hope, I wish you well, and I hope that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we actively have got some businesses in the city centre where we adopt slightly different arrangement in terms of our commercial bags, and they actually tie the commercial bags around cardboard. So some bike shops, for example, that is predominantly the material that they dispose of. So we're actually trying to flex our service to kind of meet customer demand as well.
Councillor Waller.
Thank you. There are businesses outside of the city centre, and
which we have many.
Yes. But I think in terms of helping small businesses understand what obligations are being put on them when they have very few staff and very little time to keep on top of this is where certainly through Your Waste there is an invaluable service to be delivered, as has been done over a number of years, recognising that some recycling schemes were found to result in large piles of rubbish in Far East, which was not being recycled fairly or ethically, and certainly not environmentally friendly ways. So I think it's giving that surety to people that they can rely on him closest they can get to impartial advice. So and the same with the garden waste. Is the charge going up to £49? It is. That's something that people are very interested in, that because not all parts of the city are able to subscribe to the same levels as feature in this report. Thanks.
Any response to that?
Just I suppose in terms of reassurance to the points that Councillor Waller raised, and probably touching on a point that Councillor Burton raised earlier, it is very much our aim to make sure that all businesses are supported to understand what the changes mean for them, whether that's changes that come in now in April or whether that's changes that are due to come in further down the line. The one thing that is, I suppose, a little bit unclear at the moment, and it does relate to the point you asked about enforcement, Councillor Burton, is that there is, again, even though the schemes start from April, there is still very little detail around what enforcement, if any, is going to take place against businesses that perhaps don't enter into the recycling of the waste as they should. And that's one of the things that we're trying to put pressure on the government for, is actually for that guidance and information to come out sooner rather than later. We're only 4.5 months away, and some of the key details have yet to be published.
Thank you. Might colleagues have, I know we've got 1 or 2 recommendations because colleagues have touched on them, and I'm going to try and memorise them accurately. Councillor Waller, I think you raised one potential recommendation around sort of the consultation with residents and communication. Would you be kind enough to put forward a form of words?
So it was to link the communication with education on what happens to the materials, and to review the way in which it's collected, so that there's understanding about what works for different circumstances. So that if you're devising a new system, that you've actually got buy-in.
Thank you. And that's helpful. Councillor Stewart.
Wasn't recommendations, I thought I'd caught your eye earlier, so.
Oh, forgive me. No, fire away.
Just on the increase to green bin charge, I mean, obviously worth saying that presumably it's not definitely going up, it's subject to the consultation, because we've been told that the consultation will be listened to and everything like that, so wouldn't want any residents to think anything of.
Sorry, no, it's just the figure, because that's.
Yeah,
the figure that
exactly.
North Yorkshire's.
We want the consultation to be meaningful. So just one comment I've got, and then one question. The one question is probably, I'd have thought this would be asked loads, but it's never asked. How much more difficult would it be for collections to be fortnightly for everything rather than weekly? I appreciate that, you have the same drivers doing the same routes, but, would it be a lot more difficult for people to have everything at one time? So we have like 1/14 of our days, everything strewn with bins, rather than 1/7 of our days. And the second one was just really a point, obviously, sort of heard about the person with the tray and the microwave and everything like that. I do think there's a massive amount more that can be done on commercial waste, particularly when some things are profitable. I'm work in a shared office of 30 businesses, and for as long as I've been in there, they've just had a paper and card recycling bank. Things like, drinks cans and plastic bottles, they've only just started taking them the last few weeks, and I was, sort of prompting for that, because it made me really uncomfortable, the idea that 30 years ago, we got taught about the difference between aluminium and steel cans, and having to put those putting those in the bin. Obviously, I should have been a good person and taken them home. But I think there's a lot more we can do for the general good of the city, and potentially getting some of these things we can make money for, businesses. And also related to that, I think we could do more in terms of bins across the city, where we can put recyclables, in one part and waste in another, because I think it's getting physical stuff recycled there. But I think that's also a really good statement of intent about the sort of city that want to be.
Thank you. Response?
Yeah, completely agree with the commercial recycling generally. I had right at the beginning just after last May, a visit to Allison Park, and I was really shocked at the amount of recyclates in there being incinerated, which hadn't gone through, and it was all coming in through lorries from commercial output rather than not from curbside. It was commercial, and it's it's shocking. Just I know Ben can answer this, because I've asked this question a lot of times. Why don't we have the individual recycling bins in York? Because you see them in Leeds, you see them elsewhere. Ben will say it better than I do, but I think the answer is that they went and scoped that out in those cities, and that if you start off and have a warden next to it who says, oh, your cup is in this one and that kind of thing is in that one, you get, correct me, but 80% recycling rates in terms of non-contamination. But the minute you take someone, you don't have actually somebody standing there helping people to say which bit you put your item in, the contamination rate goes through the roof, and it's not worth it. So actually those are not very well recycled. So they look good, it's great virtue signaling, and it maybe makes people feel better that they are recycling. But you can tell me if I'm wrong. I think this is the consistent response I've had, is that actually they aren't very good, because and I'm ignorant of it as well. I sort of stand over those bins in other cities, and you have a lid of a recyclable, disposable, compostable maybe cup. Is that separate to the cup? Which one do I put it in? And where does the tea bag go? Is that and it, I don't do it very well, because I don't really know what the answer is, but I think they don't work well. Is that fair, Ben?
Yeah, it's you covered that really well, actually. Yeah, the trial in Leeds city centre was done through the city council and a company called Hubbub, and as Councillor Kent rightly said, they put containers into the city centre where residents could, or visitors, residents, whoever was in the city centre, could actually dispose of various materials in various different compartments in those bins, and they actually had staff directing people on what to do. When they had the staff in, they were running at an 80% recycling rate and a 20% contamination rate. When they took those human resources out and just left the bins there, it completely flipped. It went the other way. So it went 20% being in the right and then 80% contamination. So what it was actually doing was it was actually costing Leeds Council more to dispose of that waste through those means than it was for when the trial was in place. not to say that it can't be done, but trying to break that cycle and how you do it, I think is a very difficult thing that nationally policymakers are kind of grappling with. And I think that is part of the thinking behind things like the deposit return schemes are to try and invoke that kind of behaviour change. It's completely right to suggest it, but the research that's been done has indicated that when you take that human resource out, you're flipping the 80-20. In terms of collection days, that it's done to maximise kind of efficiency of operation. The other thing that to probably bear in mind is that if you had all the same waste stream being collected, you'd actually be tipping off into the same hall at Harewood Wyn. So currently our wagons tip in three different locations. So on the same site, there's actually a separate shed where household waste is disposed of. There's then a separate shed that has 2 different compartments. A paper card goes into one compartment, glass tins and plastics goes into the other, and then there's obviously a separate part of the yard where the garden waste is tipped off at. If we had all of the collections happening at the same time, you'd have a big traffic jam of vehicles all waiting to tip off the same materials. So to maximise efficiency in terms of our vehicle fleet and the way in which the service is designed, and we actually have an alternate week service. So you'll have half of your city being collected on waste and half of the city being collected on recycling at any time.
But you wouldn't though, because I mean, if, for example, Cottonthorpe had, you know, all their waste done yesterday, and then Bishopthorpe had all of their waste done next week, then you'd have exactly the same amount of green and recycling and, you know, waste, but it's just to be bins out across Bishopthorpe and Cottonthorpe respectively for half the time. And that's the point.
Yeah, we'd have to look at that in relation to our vehicle fleet. Something that we could look at as part of the, you know, we want to do an exercise on round optimization, so that's something that we could look at there.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd be interested in the answer just in outline. And, you know, I mean, in terms of if you sort of say, look, you know, we've got these drivers doing this route and they know this route, and therefore we reckon it would be, you know, this cost or something like that, roughly, I'd be interested in that, you know, because it does seem to me it'd be better for people, particularly, you know, as we broaden the range of things that can be recycled and everything like that, just have one day rather than, you know, every single week we have it.
So if we made that a recommendation for it to be looked into, is that yeah, I'd be comfortable with that. Thanks, Councillor Stewart.
To just go back to the commercial waste point, it's worth noting, and it's not my particular area of expertise, but it's worth noting that the majority, I can't remember the exact number, that of our customer base actually is classed as micro businesses. So they've got 10 or less employees. And we often service a lot of customers in the city centre that a lot of other suppliers will not service because they can't hold a physical container, they can't hold a bin. And whilst it is cheaper for you to recycle than get rid of your refuse, you can't hold a bin anywhere and you can't present it. You can't also separate that waste. And people are often forced into doing something that they'd rather not do because of the limitations. So if you have a shop on the Shambles, for example, you can't, there's nowhere to store a bin, you can't present it on the street. And so we use bag collections, which most other providers will not do that, and they won't provide that service. So it's not always that the business doesn't want to, it's just that there are physical limitations of the location of that business. But having said that, we are working on solutions to this and are trying to find ways around it.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time. Do we have any more suggested recommendations? Councillor Merritt.
Yeah, it's been kind enough to give us all these suggestions in section 12.
Yeah.
You ought to broadly endorse them. I just have one caveat on 12.2 about removing bins class. Sorry.
One caveat on 12.2 about removing bins classified as commercial. we do need to be careful that we're not going to end up penalising residents in a particular area because there is commercial abuse. Prefer to address the abuse rather than necessarily lose facilities for residents. But yeah, I accept there's a balance to be achieved.
Just in relation to that, councillor, there are a couple of finite locations that we would probably recommend removal, and that's a number of these sites were put in before curbside collection was expanded to some of these neighbourhoods. So I think there is an option for us to not to reduce significantly, but certainly to rationalise the number down.
Thank you. Councillor Kemp?
Just to add to that, because that's a question that was asked at full council by Councillor Fenton, and it is a question in the budget consultation, and it would be really useful for everybody to input their thoughts on that. In really to find out who is using the sort of local bring sites. Is it largely commercial? Are they being well used? Because given that everybody does have recycling collected from their doorsteps, apart from a period over Christmas, but when the excess will be collected at the end, these also seem to be sites which are frequently used for fly tipping and extra, and so but you have the local knowledge about that if they're in your wards, and it would be really useful for you to feed that back as to how you think they work, and are they working well, or are they being abused, and how necessary are they? That's, you know, useful information, so thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hook, is it a recommendation? By the way.
First recommendation, you say that wet paper's not nearly as valuable and counted as contaminated. So please, can we get lids on our boxes? Because so many people have lost them, and you know, we definitely need.
Free.
Sorry?
You can have lids, they're free.
Yeah, but right. So we need to know how to get them. Can you publish that as well? How to get the lids?
That everywhere.
See, the website is not.
It's everywhere.
People need the
Well,
paper.
if you got the leaflet, if you have garden waste and you got a leaflet about recycling for 60, that we were sent to 66,000 residents recently, there was a reminder on that about where you can get your bins and boxes, and they are still completely free.
Right. And the other one was, can we have garden waste collections at the new developments that don't have them at the moment?
Yes, the answer to that is yes. So the proposal in 2025 is to obviously expand the service to some of those new build estates that couldn't have them before. So thinking of a Langley Gate development in your area, that's one of the areas that we will be looking to send letters to. And there are, again, some households on the Germany Beck development that haven't had a garden waste service previously. So we will be able to offer those households the option to subscribe in 2025.
And going back to the lids on the boxes, we are actually about to put recycle boxes and lids into household waste sites. So if residents ring and contact us and say they'd like one, they can pick up their own boxes and lids from the household waste sites rather than wait a long time for us to deliver them because the demand is so high. And at that point, they will be offered that you can also bring your damaged boxes back to site, and we'll get them off the street and then replace them with the new ones. And then hopefully by people coming to site, seeing that there are boxes there, asking the question about how do I get a box? Can I have a box? That will then again get the message out, and another way for people to get them.
Thank you. I'm only going to let people speak if they are specific, succinct recommendations, because time is well on. Councillor Merritt and then Councillor Vassie.
Councillor Hook prompted me on the garden collections because we have a number of properties in Guildhall who keep asking for garden collections, and we're looking forward to that. But it's all the flats and the HMOs, the short-term holiday lets, which Ben talked about in his initial comments. I'm not sure it's actually in your set of recommendations, but certainly trying to roll out, separate collections for those along the lines that you were talking about. I very much support. I'd like to see that in my recommendations.
I think it is covered, isn't it?
12.5. In at 12.5.
Yeah, I was trying to try.
I appreciate it's a long report.
Councillor Vassie.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, my recommendation is
fine.
to support the council, encouraging government to set out enforcement measures to ensure compliance by businesses.
Yeah,
We heard about that, and I think it would be good for us to offer our support. And I've also put there and encouraged the council to work with small and micro businesses to help them recycle their waste. Because it's clear that there's an opportunity. It may not happen in the next 4 months, but those small businesses, in my experience, are often ones that are committed to doing things if we can help them. So
yeah,
encourage government to set out enforcement measures for compliance and encourage the council to work with small and micro businesses to help them recycle.
very comfortable with that, given that it's a, you know, an active piece of work anyway, but I will wrap it up there, colleagues. Can't believe we've covered this much time with just 2 items. Fair play, everyone. Thank you again, officers, for all your time tonight. And if I may, thank you also for putting up with the large number of probably not always great emails that you receive from us as councillors, especially me. I think I am always grateful for your assistance, and I dread to think what your inboxes look like, because you've got an entire city to think about, not just one ward. So yeah, thank you, and I hope you have a good rest of your night. In terms of the work plan item, colleagues, I have asked Councillor Healy as Vice Chair if he can meet me in the next couple of weeks, just to flesh out what the next few months will look like, because the work plan gets a bit loose moving forward. So I'm sure that will happen in due course, but if you get any ideas, just shout up offline, and we'll pick that up. The work plan's a constant work in progress. And beyond that, I have no urgent business. So thank you all. Cheers.